I have a confession to make. Up until last week, I had almost zero interest in ChatGPT, let alone anything related to AI. I knew it was something people were playing with to make art and write code, but for me, it always seemed like a toy, a fanciful distraction that was intriguing, but would never be able to create anything of significance, let alone make or adjust arguments for or against certain positions. And boy, was I wrong. I do a lot of Roman history stuff on this channel, and most of what I enjoy reading and writing about involves the late Republic era and Julius Caesar. I've always hated the position that modern historians take with the Gallic War in particular, and Caesar in general, and I think the majority of what is said about this man and the events he was involved with are at best misrepresented and at worst outright fabricated. So when a friend of mine sent me a link to ChatGPT and encouraged me to have a conversation with it, I knew exactly what I wanted to ask. What follows now is the transcript of my conversation with ChatGPT, in which I try to convince the AI that its original position is incorrect with 6 questions, plus a few bonus questions to test the AI's ability to deal with counterpoints after that. I'll read each question and answer, and follow them up with my reasoning for my specific question or point, as well as my thoughts on ChatGPT's answers, and I think you'll be surprised with the results. Question 1. I asked, who was primarily responsible for the Gallic War? ChatGPT responded, Julius Caesar was primarily responsible for the Gallic War. As a Roman general and statesman, Caesar led the Roman Republic's military campaigns in Gaul, modern-day France and parts of neighboring countries, between 58 BC and 50 BC. He initiated the conquest of Gaul, which became one of the most significant military campaigns in Roman history. Caesar's conquest of Gaul was motivated by several factors, including expanding Roman influence, securing military glory, and strengthening his political position in Rome. Over the course of the Gallic War, Caesar faced numerous Gallic tribes and leaders, including the Helvetii, the Suebi, the Belgae, and the famous chieftain Vercingetorix of the Arverni. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul were documented by himself in his work Commentarii de Bello Gallico, Commentaries on the Gallic War, providing valuable first-hand accounts of the events and his military strategies. These campaigns ultimately resulted in the Roman conquest of Gaul and significantly expanded Roman territories in Western Europe. This was my first question, and it's also the most obvious question to ask. And I think the answer that ChatGPT gave is probably the stock standard answer that most people would give who are passingly familiar with the Gallic War. It's not entirely incorrect. In fact, it's mostly correct, which is why it's convincing. Of course, Caesar did lead the Republic's military campaigns in Gaul. It was between 58 and 50 BC. He initiated the conquest of Gaul, which would be the first point I guess I would take issue with, because that's a little vague. ChatGPT also goes on to list personal motivations of Caesar, hypothetical motivations, which I also will take issue with later, but we'll leave that alone for now. So let's look at question number 2. I asked, but wasn't the initial conflict started by the migration of the Helvetii, not by Caesar? ChatGPT responds, you're correct. The initial conflict that sparked the Gallic War was indeed the migration of the Helvetii, a Celtic tribe located in the territory of present-day Switzerland. In 58 BC, the Helvetii, along with several other Gallic tribes, sought to migrate from their homeland to Western Gaul, likely due to pressure from Germanic tribes to the east and internal political issues. Julius Caesar, who was then serving as proconsul of Transalpine Gaul, intervened in the situation. He saw the Helvetian migration as a potential threat to Roman interests and stability in the region. Caesar decided to confront the Helvetii and prevent their migration, which led to the outbreak of hostilities. Caesar's decision to intervene in Helvetian migration was influenced by various factors, including his desire to assert Roman authority in Gaul, expand Roman territories, and enhance his own political standing and military reputation. So while the migration of the Helvetii initiated the conflict, it was Caesar's response and subsequent actions that ultimately led to the outbreak of the Gallic War. My second question here is specifically about the spark, the first event that caused the opening of hostilities, which is unmistakably Gallic. Now, ChatGPT mentioned the migration to Western Gaul by the Helvetii and their allied tribes, And it also mentions, of course, Caesar in his role as the governor or proconsul of Transalpine Gaul and his interventions. Now, an interesting thing here is ChatGPT says it was a threat to Roman interests and stability in the region, which is true, but it was also a threat to Roman territories directly. The first path that the Helvetii chose for their western migration was through Roman territory, not Roman allied territory, but the province itself, and through some of the allied tribes' territory as well. The Romans absolutely had a right to deny any passage to foreigners across their land. So Caesar's initial response is in effect defending Roman territory itself. Subsequently, it became about Roman interests and stability because they changed their course and they were going through Adri and Ambari and other allied tribes' land. But I think that's an important distinction to make. Again, ChatGPT ventures to guess at Caesar's personal ambitions and desires, which again, I'll get to in another question later. Question number 3. It was the Aedui and other tribes who requested Caesar to provide military aid to Gaul to defend against Ariovistus and the Germans. How can Caesar be blamed for initiating the Gallic War when he spent over a year fighting on behalf of the Gauls? ChatGPT answers, "You're correct in pointing out that Julius Caesar's involvement in Gaul initially stemmed from a request for assistance from the Aedui and other Gallic tribes against the threat posed by Ariovistus and the Germanic tribes. This situation indeed predates the conflict with the Helvetii. Caesar's decision to intervene in Gaul was driven by various factors, including his political ambitions, desire for military glory, and strategic calculations regarding Roman interests in the region. While his initial actions may have been motivated by providing aid to the Gauls against external threats, the subsequent events and his broader campaign to conquer Gaul can be seen as the initiation of what became known as the Gallic War. Caesar's intervention in Gaul eventually evolved into a broader military campaign aimed at expanding Roman control over the entire region. This campaign involved numerous battles and conflicts with various Gallic tribes, culminating in the conquest of Gaul by the Romans. So while Caesar's initial involvement may have been in response to the request for aid by the Gauls, his broader campaign and conquest of Gaul can be considered the initiation of the Gallic War as it unfolded over several years and involved significant military action on Caesar's part." So, my question, of course, was specifically aimed to move on to the next point in the Gallic War, which is the conflict with the Germans. It happens in the same year as the Helvetii migration, 58 BC. And again, I pose the question, how can Caesar be blamed for initiating the war at this point? Now we have two conflicts initiated externally. And ChatGPT's answer, even though he gives even though it gives a little bit of ground here, saying that the Germans and their situation in Gaul predated the conflict with the Helvetii, and actually predated, of course, Caesar himself as proconsul, it still was Caesar who initiated and who was the primary cause of the Gallic War. Once again, ChatGPT makes assumptions on Caesar's personal desires or motives for starting the war, and it's also still maintaining that the initiation of the Gallic War was still by Caesar, despite having now two examples of the conflicts being initiated by non-Roman parties. Let's look at question number 4. I asked, after the defeat of Ariovistus, the Belgae began to amass a large army with the aim of attacking southern Gaul and the Romans. It seems like here too, it was the Gauls initiating war, not Caesar. So the Belgae coalition, we'll call it a revolt, but it was a coalition. They weren't revolting against anything. They weren't under occupation. Was a coalition of several tribes belonging to the greater Belgae states. That was the northeastern region of Gaul. And they were upset by Roman involvement in Gallic affairs, even though they was invited in by the Gauls themselves, and they wanted to break the Roman power brokerage over the region. ChatGPT answers with this. You make a valid point. After the defeat of Ariovistus, Caesar indeed faced further challenges from other Gallic tribes, including the Belgae, who were amassing a large army with the intention of attacking southern Gaul and the Romans. In this instance as well, the initiative for conflict did not directly come from Caesar, but from the Belgae and other Gallic tribes who sought to resist Roman expansion and assert their own autonomy. Caesar responded to these threats by taking preemptive military action to defend Roman interests and maintain control over Gaul. Caesar's actions in responding to these challenges were part of his broader campaign to secure Roman dominance in Gaul and expand Roman territories. While the specific circumstances of each conflict may vary, the overarching pattern is one of Caesar asserting Roman authority and subjugating Gallic tribes to Roman rule. So while Caesar may not have initiated every conflict in Gaul, his overall campaign can still be seen as a concerted effort to conquer the region and bring it under Roman control. This answer was very interesting for me, because once again, it validates the point that I am making, and it admits that the initiative, or the cause of this conflict, was once again non-Roman. However, now it's starting to assert things that I don't think are necessarily true. So, for example, the Belgae sought to resist Roman expansion and assert their own autonomy. I don't understand what it means by asserting their own autonomy, because at this point they were all completely autonomous. Caesar not only had not ventured at all into their territory, by this time he was actually venturing away from it. He was planning to go east. Now, of course, they wouldn't have known Caesar's personal agenda, but to insinuate that they were trying to break free and assert their own autonomy, I think is outright false. Once again, we see the same statements on Caesar's motives and overarching patterns, and in the very end, of course, it says, Caesar may not have initiated every conflict, but his overall campaign can still be seen as a concerted effort to conquer the region and bring it under control. And I'm going to take issue with this point as well. Question number 5. How can you call it preemptive military action when there was already an assembled army that was prepared to attack the South? ChatGPT answers, you're correct. Preemptive military action may not be the most accurate way to describe Caesar's response in this specific situation. The term preemptive implies acting to prevent an anticipated attack or threat before it occurs, whereas in this case, there was already an assembled army preparing to attack. A more appropriate term might be defensive military action or reactionary military action. Caesar responded to the threat posed by the assembled army of the Belgae and other Gallic tribes by taking military measures to defend Roman interests and protect southern Gaul from invasion. In this context, Caesar's actions can be seen as a response to an immediate and pressing threat rather than a preemptive measure aimed at preventing future conflict. He mobilized his forces and engaged the Belgae in battle to neutralize the threat and maintain Roman control over Gaul. Thank you for pointing out this distinction, and I appreciate the opportunity to clarify. This question wasn't so much a major question to advance the conversation. I just wanted to see if it could distinguish between a preemptive military action and a reactionary campaign to an army and a plot that already existed. And to its credit, it fully acknowledges that there is a difference. Now, ChatGPT is still asserting that Caesar is trying to maintain Roman control over Gaul, which, again, I'm not sure if I agree with that point, but let's look at the next question. Question number 6. Given our discussion so far, do you still think Julius Caesar was the primary cause of the Gallic War? Or was it in fact a combination of Gallic and Germanic aggression that forced Caesar to take more extreme actions in the region? ChatGPT answers, it's evident from our discussion that the causes of the Gallic War are multifaceted and cannot be attributed solely to Julius Caesar. While Caesar's actions and ambitions certainly played a significant role in the conflict, it's clear that Gallic and Germanic aggression, as well as internal political dynamics within Gaul, also contributed to the outbreak of hostilities. The migration of the Helvetii, the threat posed by Ariovistus and the Germanic tribes, and the assembling of the Belgae army are all examples of Gallic and Germanic aggression that preceded Caesar's intervention in Gaul. These external threats forced Caesar to respond with military action to defend Roman interests and maintain control over the region. Additionally, internal power struggles and conflicts among Gallic tribes further fueled tensions and contributed to the volatility of the situation. Caesar's intervention in Gaul may have been influenced by his own political ambitions and desire for military glory, but it cannot be divorced from the broader context of Gallic and Germanic aggression and the complex dynamics within Gaul at the time. Therefore, it's more accurate to view the Gallic War as a result of a combination of factors, including Caesar's ambitions, Gallic and Germanic aggression, and internal dynamics within Gaul, rather than attributing it solely to Caesar as the primary cause. At this point, I was quite satisfied with ChatGPT's ability to take in new or controversial, contrarian information and adjust its original premise or its original answer and integrate multiple factors. But there were still a few things I wasn't too happy with. The first thing being Caesar's actions and ambitions. It's still making some assumptions here that we don't really know. And the second is the idea that he's there to maintain Roman control over the region. I was satisfied at this point for the most part, but I wanted to take it a little further, so I asked it 3 more questions. Question number 7. I asked, there are also many problems with assuming the personal ambitions and desires of Caesar, since most of these desires are only hypothetical in nature. In fact, given that Caesar allowed the Helvetii to return to their homeland, and also pardoned and befriended many hostile Gallic tribes, it seems wrong to say that Caesar held a strong desire to conquer all of Gaul, when in fact he was more than content to let the tribes keep their land and retain their leadership. ChatGPT answers, you bring up valid points, and it's essential to consider the full context of Caesar's actions and decisions in Gaul, rather than attributing them solely to personal ambitions or desires. While Caesar's motives may have included political ambitions and a desire for military glory, it's clear that his approach to governing Gaul was more nuanced and pragmatic than simply seeking conquest for its own sake. Caesar's policies towards the Gallic tribes were often characterized by a combination of coercion, diplomacy, and strategic alliances. He did indeed show clemency and leniency towards some tribes, allowing them to retain their autonomy and leadership in exchange for their loyalty to Rome. Additionally, his decision to allow the Helvetii to return to their homeland rather than pursuing further conflict demonstrates a willingness to seek peaceful resolutions when possible. Caesar's ultimate goal in Gaul may have been to secure Roman dominance and expand Roman territories, but he also recognized the importance of maintaining stability and order in the region. His actions, including pardoning and befriending hostile Gallic tribes, can be seen as pragmatic efforts to achieve these broader objectives, rather than solely driven by personal ambition. Therefore, while Caesar's motives and intentions may be open to interpretation, it's clear that his governance of Gaul was characterized by a combination of strategic calculation, diplomatic maneuvering, and military force, rather than solely driven by a desire for conquest. This question I asked because I think it is a completely glossed over point by most people who talk about the Gallic War. In 58 BC, after the Helvetii were defeated by Caesar, Caesar specifically requested that all the people of the Helvetii were returned to their land and allowed to live in peace. He even negotiated with surrounding tribes to provide them with stores of food and materials so they could rebuild. Because remember, the Helvetii actually torched all of their fields, all of their farms, all of their homes and towns and cities. They scorched earth themselves so they wouldn't be tempted to return home. So not only did Caesar allow them to return and keep their original lands, he actually encouraged them to rebuild and regrow. He didn't force them all into slavery. He understood that, especially because the Helvetii's position on the Rhine against the Germans who were right across the border, they provided a very essential buffer against any Germanic aggression crossing the Rhine. And I think that's important to realize, is especially when it comes to the border nations, we see a lot of Caesar wheeling and dealing and not trying to just subdue everyone, because that territory is very susceptible. It came up in the Cimbrian War that was fought, of course, before Caesar's time. That was by his uncle. But it's very important to realize that from the outset, there wasn't a land grab at all. In fact, there was a very concerted effort by Caesar to either maintain or restore borders. And that's actually going to be the next point we get to. So let's look at question number 8, which is in fact that question. Question number 8. You've said many times that Caesar's campaigns aim to assert Roman dominance and expand Roman territories. However, during the first several years of the Gallic War, Rome did not expand its territory in the region at all. It seems incorrect to claim that Caesar desired expansion, when in fact he repeatedly chose to maintain current borders or restore old ones. ChatGPT gives a long answer here, so it says, you raise a valid point. While Caesar's campaigns in Gaul did ultimately result in the expansion of Roman territories, particularly in the later stages of the Gallic War, it's true that during the initial years of the conflict, the focus may have been more on maintaining Roman control over the region rather than outright expansion. Caesar's motivations and objectives in Gaul were likely multifaceted and evolved over time. While the desire for military glory and political power may have played a role in his decision to intervene in Gaul, other factors such as strategic considerations, diplomatic goals, and the need to secure Roman interests in the region also likely influenced his actions. In the early stages of the Gallic War, Caesar may have prioritized maintaining stability and order in Gaul and protecting Roman territories from external threats, such as the migrations of the Helvetii and the aggression of Ariovistus. His decision to restore old borders or maintain current ones may have been driven by these considerations rather than a deliberate strategy of territorial expansion. As the conflict progressed, however, Caesar's campaigns became more aggressive, and the conquest of Gaul became a primary objective. The later stages of the Gallic War saw significant territorial gains for Rome, as Caesar's forces defeated numerous Gallic tribes and brought them under Roman control. Therefore, while Caesar's initial motivations and objectives in Gaul may have been more defensive or reactive in nature, the later stages of the conflict saw a shift towards more assertive and expansionist policies, resulting in the eventual conquest of Gaul by the Romans. Now, at this point, I didn't want to take ChatGPT on a tour through 8.5 years of history, so I chose not to raise any points in regards to the later campaigns, especially the British expedition or the first and second crossings of the Rhine. The point of this question that I ask is that it's difficult to call the Gallic War an expansionist war started by the Romans when, one, it wasn't started by the Romans. In fact, it was at multiple points initiated by Gauls. And even though there's some people who are going to whine and say it's a casus belli and Caesar made it up, Caesar didn't make this up. Caesar didn't make up an entire migration of Helvetii. Caesar didn't make up an entire Belgic army of hundreds of thousands of Gauls about to march to the south. Caesar didn't make up Ariovistus, and Caesar's negotiations with Ariovistus also weren't over the top. He wasn't demanding anything out of this world. This isn't like the Third Punic War where they're demanding that the Carthaginians blow up their own city and move it 50 miles inland or something like that. This was quite different. Some people are trying to draw lines where none actually exist. So, when it comes to ChatGPT's answer here, it's starting to shift more and more towards separating the early Gallic War to the late Gallic War, which I think is productive. I think that's an actual interesting conversation to have. And so my last question is going to be about this very shift in policy that we seem to see with Caesar. And I've read the Gallic War many times. I love this book. I love the account that Caesar writes. And you can definitely tell the points at which his attitude is beginning to change, and his mind, his kindness to the Gauls is starting to sour. And it's actually almost funny to read some of those points where he's getting really frustrated. But let's look at the very last question here, the final question I asked. Could it not be said that this shift was also a result of the failure of his defensive position to secure stability in the region? It seems that after the defeat of the Belgae and the revolt and defeat of the Veneti, and the invasion of the Tencteri and Eusepidis, that Caesar realized how susceptible Gaul was to massive shifts in power and policy. Realizing this, he came to the conclusion that the best defense was a good offense. ChatGPT answers, "That's an insightful perspective. Indeed, the failure of Caesar's initial defensive position to secure stability in the region may have contributed to his decision to adopt a more aggressive and offensive approach in Gaul. As you mentioned, despite Caesar's efforts to maintain stability and protect Roman interests in Gaul through defensive measures, such as suppressing the Belgae revolt and defeating the Veneti, the region remained susceptible to internal unrest and external threats. The invasion of the Tencteri and Eusepidis, as well as other conflicts and revolts, highlighted the ongoing challenges and vulnerabilities faced by Roman control in Gaul. Recognizing the limitations of a purely defensive strategy, Caesar may have concluded that proactive military action and expansion were necessary to assert Roman dominance, stabilize the region, and secure Roman interests in Gaul. By taking the initiative and pursuing offensive campaigns against the hostile tribes, Caesar sought to preempt potential threats, consolidate Roman control, and bring greater stability to the region. In this sense, the shift from defense to offense in Caesar's approach to Gaul can be seen as a response to the failure of his initial defensive position to achieve lasting stability and security. By adopting a more aggressive and proactive strategy, Caesar aimed to address the underlying challenges and vulnerabilities facing Roman control in Gaul and assert Roman dominance more effectively. So looking back, I don't really like the way I phrased this question, because it gets a little bit too into the hypothetical. I'm starting to fall in the trap of assuming motives or deciding for myself on what a personal, what kind of ambition Caesar did or didn't have. But the point I wanted to make here is how susceptible Gaul itself was not only to external threats to the Germans, which by the late war had suffered invasions 3 times in the past 50 or 60 years. Not only invasions, but utter subjugation in some cases. And also internally, how Gaul was so fractious, it was so divided, that no united front was ever made. And people might say, well, what about Vercingetorix? What about 52 BC, the United Gallic Front? Even that wasn't as united as you might think. There were several tribes who still stayed allied with Rome. This wasn't all of Gaul with one voice and one purpose, not at all. A lot of them had been coerced or bribed or lied to help Vercingetorix, and were later pardoned again by Caesar. But that's getting a little bit off the beaten path from this conversation. Suffice it to say, ChatGPT seems not only able to assert an initial point, but adjust its arguments and integrate new information into its premises to highlight subtleties and give nuances, which for me is extremely impressive. The real test here, I think, would be if someone else asked the same line of questions that I did, or a similar line, and see if they just get the same responses, or if the answers that ChatGPT gives become a little bit more nuanced because of this conversation. I would hope that ChatGPT isn't programmed simply to be very diplomatic and agree with me for the sake of agreeing with me, that it's looking at the points and recognizing discontinuity with its own arguments. But that's for you guys to try. So if you guys ask ChatGPT some historical questions, you get into the Gallic War, let me know down in the comments. I'd love to see it. Thank you for watching this video. If you made it this far, it was an exciting journey for me in this conversation with the machine. You can leave a like and subscribe, comment below with your thoughts on ChatGPT and this line of questioning that I did, and I'll see you guys in the next one.